Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from U.S. tax reform to the OECD's latest developments on digital taxation. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's U.S. International Tax Services Leader. You can follow me on Twitter at XBorderTax. This week, we've hijacked the traveling inside tax policy studio outside Tucson, Arizona, where I'm happy to be joined by Tadd Fowler. Tadd is the Vice President of Tax Operations at Procter Gamble and was recently promoted to the role of Assistant Treasurer. Tadd, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. Glad to be here.
We do a lot of navel-gazing here on the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast and a lot of introspection with a bunch of advisors. You're officially our first taxpayer, like real taxpayer, that has joined the podcast.
Glad I could be first in something, Doug.
That's great. So several things I'd like to talk about, because you guys have really, Procter & Gamble has been front and center on a number of issues and very active in the global tax policy debate and discussion. But maybe before we talk about GILTI, which fans of the podcast know is one of my favorite topics, and we'll talk a little bit about digital tax, let's start with the treasurer role. Very exciting. Congratulations on the new role. And what I'm interested to know is, was tax reform, was the TCJA really the panacea for cash and for treasury management? We now have our so-called territorial system, which, as you know, I don't really believe it's truly a territorial system, but with the repeal of Section 956, or the option to be able to opt out of 956, talk about, particularly your experience in almost 30 years in tax and now as a treasurer role. How has the game changed with tax reform?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Doug. I think, one of the things I'm learning as I get into my role is there's a lot of different aspects of managing the earnings of a company. And I think, U.S. tax policy historically was another barrier to managing our earnings as efficiently as we could. If you go back sort of historically, P&G's been building its international business for over 100 years. And, we have a regional supply chain just to be cost effective and to be able to compete with local and regional competition. And so between investing in our brands as we're entering new markets, building production capacity, the buildup of cash wasn't really an issue for us for a long time. And it was really probably the last 5-6 years where we started building excess cash overseas. And so the issue of repatriation, became a bigger concern for P&G, really on a longer term basis. Mm-hmm. From a capital structure standpoint and from a rewarding of our shareholder standpoint, I mean, we, really over the last 15 years have distributed over 100% of our global earnings to our shareholders, whether it's through the dividend, which is about historically a 50 to 60% payout ratio, earnings payout ratio, and share repurchase. We've been rewarding our shareholders, and when you've got 40% of your cash flow overseas and it's starting to build up, the ability to get that cash and get it to your shareholders becomes very important. And we're fortunate to have a very high credit rating. We're a AA- credit rated company, so we had access to financing, mm-hmm. All right, and we had access to financing at very cheap rates. So as cash is building up offshore, we were borrowing in the U.S. to compensate for the fact we didn't want to repatriate, so that we could give our shareholders their returns. Mm-hmm. And in order to maintain a AA- credit rating, you've got to meet certain financial metrics. And on a long-term basis, we weren't going to be able to continue to meet the metrics we needed to keep our credit rating, which we view as a very key asset of the company. And so eventually, and it wasn't necessarily in the short term, but eventually we were going to get to a point we had to make a decision. Do we reduce share repurchase? Do we reduce the dividend? Do we repatriate cash, or do we take a downgrade? And those are not a decision that anybody wants to make in the company, particularly if you're the CFO. So we knew that on a long-term basis, we needed to get to a different system, which mm-hmm. is why tax policy and playing in the tax policy arena was a key priority for the company. I think now that we're in a, as you call it, quasi-territorial system, that capital constraint of repatriating cash has gone away. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's one less barrier we have to manage. And post-tax reform, we've been on a mission to repatriate our cash as quickly as possible. I think last I checked, we've repatriated probably in the neighborhood of $15 to $16 billion in the last 18, 19 months, and we've effectively used that to repay debt. Okay. Also, we've invested in our U.S. business, and it's continuing to fund our shareholder returns. So I would say yes. And if I look at tax reform more generally, certainly the rate cut was important. But on a really, it was a pro-growth policy, okay? So that certainly as a consumer products company is probably the most important policy angle of tax reform.
Sure.
It gave us some level of certainty and predictability midterm, okay, in terms of knowing what system we were going to be in. There were debates the last 10 years about should we be a worldwide system, for example, okay, which would have been very uncompetitive. And so we got some midterm certainty and predictability there. But the biggest benefit by far is on a long-term basis, we're not capital constrained. We can access our offshore earnings, we can invest them where we need to, and that puts us on a level playing field with our foreign competitors who are, very astute, very efficient in how they were able to manage money. And on a long-term basis, we could have not have competed without, the ability to access our offshore earnings on an as-needed basis. I would say, maybe the one disappointment from a Treasury perspective with tax reform is I'm not confident yet we could move our internal banking operations to the United States. I wish, today we've got our internal banking operations out of the UK. It's been a great place to have those. But, if the U.S. tax laws worked, I would think, the U.S. would be a very competitive place to move our banking operations. But I think there's still some uncertainty for me around 956. I think BEAT raises some interesting issues, withholding taxes, et cetera, to where, the certainty and predictability we have in the UK just mandates that we stay there for the time being. But, those are probably, how I think about tax reform from the Treasury angle.
Yeah, so let's unpack, let's unpack a couple of those. So I think the first point that you were making was that under the old regime, simply bringing back those earnings to fund dividends, share buybacks, et cetera, was just so costly with the 35% U.S. tax rate plus the state rate. So, the new system with the lower rate plus the fact that we had Section 965, which we've talked a lot about on the podcast, gives you that opportunity. You've already paid tax on those undistributed earnings. Now you can bring those back. And I also think there's actually some incentive from a pure tax perspective to bring those earnings back. You bring back that E&P, it reduces some of your interest expense apportionment under the new system. You can manage 986C, which is foreign exchange gain or loss. So there really is some tax policy incentive to bring that cash back. And it sounds like you guys have already been just pouring it back.
Yeah, well, and you get rid of the negative arbitrage of having cash offshore earning a lower rate than borrowing onshore. And even though our rates are pretty cheap, it's still, you're not making money in that situation. So from a before tax standpoint, it makes sense. And certainly from a tax point of view, there are issues with keeping cash offshore, certainly. And so our objective has been to get it home as quickly as we can get it.
And then the other point that you made with respect to your non-U.S. kind of financing operations in the UK, under our old system, mostly because of Section 956, big U.S. multinationals generally had two separate financing operations, right? You had your operations in the U.S. and you had your operations offshore. The reason that companies needed to keep those separate from a tax perspective was that, was to try to avoid 956. And, there was a technical issue that if you had your CFC as a net borrower to the cash pool, if it was one big cash pool, for example, and then with our formed and funded rules, you could theoretically end up with a 956 investment even more than the actual loans back to the U.S. And I think that for most companies, they just said, listen, we're just going to keep those separate. When tax reform was proposed, part of the initial proposal was to repeal 956 completely. And I think a lot of us were excited. It's like, oh, finally, we can do just one big cash pool, one big financing operation in the U.S. And then as reform was getting finalized, if you will, 956 snuck both back into the Senate, right, the House versions. And so, but then Treasury has since released the opportunity to effectively elect out of 956. Talk a little bit more about, how much would benefit a company like P&G to be able to operate one big cash pool versus the I say cash flow financing operations all in the U.S. versus kind of having the split system?
I think generally speaking, it would be beneficial. I don't view it as a huge constraint, at least in our ability to manage the cash situation. But I do think just from a before tax synergy perspective, I mean, we've got, the Treasury organization in the United States, our banking operations actually in the UK. But I think, I wouldn't say it's a barrier, but I would say there would be synergies by combining those operations. I don't view tax really anymore being a constraint, but I from a just efficiency standpoint, I think combining those operations would be beneficial. And I'm not confident today, even if 956 had been repealed, I still think there's issues with regards to BEAT, for example.
Right.
Okay.
So if the CFC is a net lender, and then you're going to have to accrue some interest as low as rates are, how big is that? But, we've talked a lot about on the podcast, the U.S. multinationals do not want to be in a BEAT situation, particularly because ultimately that guilty inclusion becomes immediately subject to U.S. tax without the foreign tax credits.
Yeah. And, for us, Doug, I mean, we're a long ways from BEAT, okay? But it's also one of those things that, until you can fully understand what could cause you to be in a BEAT problem, my goal is to stay as far away from it as we can. So even though it's not our top issue, we are still being very proactive about making sure we understand what could possibly cause us to be in a BEAT issue for a year, and what are the things we could do to mitigate and further move us, farther away from the cliff, if you will. So, there's a lot still to learn with that particular provision, but our goal is to stay as far away from it as possible.
That has certainly been the advice that I've been giving to my clients and taxpayers, that for those U.S. multinationals, I still don't think that rule was intended to apply, the way it has been. It's been a big shock for a number of companies. But just staying as far away as possible from that 3%, from that cliff is very important. So let's talk a little bit about guilty.
Okay.
P&G was subject of a Wall Street Journal article, several weeks ago, Richard Rubin, about guilty. And I think the surprise for many U.S. multinationals with CFCs below is that even with relatively high taxed earnings, they were still subject to this global intangible low taxed income, primarily as a result of expense apportionment.
Right.
And can you just talk a little bit about P&G's situation and how you're approaching the issue?
Yeah. It was total irony when I first woke up 6, 7 in the morning and was reading the proposed legislation and realized that the acronym for this particular provision was guilty. That was not lost upon me, and I think was very quickly understood within the tax community. That was
very pejorative term.
Yeah, very ironic.
Congress.
But look, we tax reform was a great step forward. Okay,
sure.
I think the concept of guilty, we've established now a global base of how to protect the residents' tax base, okay, and I think we'll see versions of guilty even expanding beyond the U.S. as we move forward, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about that in the digital debate. But we had understood this was a minimum tax,
right?
Okay, and our offshore tax rates, anywhere from 18 to 19% in any given year, and so, given the framework of the provision, we didn't think guilty was going to be an issue. Now, another issue was, historically, from an interest expense apportionment point of view, we were on the fair market value method. We're a company that's got a huge intangible value. Our market cap's around $250, $260 billion. We've got physical assets and inventory and working capital of 50 or 60, so there's a huge intangible value there. And the interest expense apportionment rules on a tax basis method didn't work for us, and so fair market value was a more appropriate result.
Well, and you're so old. I mean, the business is just so old, particularly in the U.S. that for companies like yourself that started in the U.S. over 100 years ago and then expanded internationally from a tax basis perspective, a lot of those assets in the U.S. were depreciated, and then you pumped equity into your foreign structure, and it created the fair market value really was a much more precise way to
Totally. Well, yeah, and I
do
mean,
it.
you look at our balance sheet; it's self-developed intangibles,
Right.
which you don't have tax basis in. So, fair market value was an important strategy for us. And when it was going away with tax reform, it was like, well, who really cares? I mean, expense apportionment's going to be irrelevant. We got a minimum tax. We pay 19% offshore. I don't need to worry about it. And then, as it turns out, we've got this expense apportionment concern. And for us, it's, not an immaterial number. It's not necessarily a material number, but from a policy perspective, it results in something we didn't think was, or our understanding of what the intention of Congress was, okay, with regards to the GILTI provision. And so, our goal is to try to move it as far along as we can to minimize the impact of expense apportionment. For us, it really comes down to two issues. Hey, we're not a highly leveraged company, okay, but we still have interest expense.
Sure.
And the inability to use fair market value. We've got 65% of our cash flows in the United States, our intellectual property is owned in the United States, and I've got 70% of my interest expenses treated as foreign source. That just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Okay. But more importantly, research and development. Okay, I mean, we're the largest R&D spender in the consumer products industry in the globe, and we've got a lot of research and development expense getting allocated to GILTI. And I certainly don't think it was the intention to try to disincentivize research and development in the United States. And arguably, these provisions do that. And so I think we are on the Hill helping people understand that and trying to do our best to help them understand we should be doing things to incentivize R&D, not disincentivize R&D. And I think we're going to make some progress. I'm optimistic. I know you and I talked this yesterday. I'm probably more optimistic than you on some of these things. Interest expense, maybe not so much. But, at the end of the day, it's a cost to the company that our competitors aren't facing. And not necessarily, I think, consistent with what we thought congressional intent was. I don't know, maybe it is. I'm not sure I'm that much of an insider, but I don't think it was, at least based on our understanding of what they were trying to do. And so our goal is to try to move it forward and minimize the impact as much as we can.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that, what the further irony for a company like P&G is you mentioned that your intangibles are in the U.S. And so as we think about global intangible low taxed income, that there's really, the intangible low tax really just doesn't make sense, with all of the historic brands that you have sitting in the U.S.
Yeah. Well, and Doug, this will get a little bit to the digital discussion, but I mean, we think of our intangibles as being, if you look at it through the tax prism, there's a couple different elements of intangibles. There's the patents and trademarks, which are owned in the United States, and ultimately that, we'll call those product intangibles. And then we have our brand and marketing intangibles, which are really owned in the region that is running the particular business. So, brand intangibles for Latin America are owned in Latin America. For Europe, they're owned in Europe. For Asia, they're owned in Asia. But so, we are generating, by the GILTI definition, we are not generating low tax intangible income. We're generating high tax intangible income, but we're being subject to tax under the low tax intangible income regime. And that just doesn't make sense. So, I think we'll make some progress. And I do think we'll see this GILTI concept played out around the rest of the world.
Yeah, one of the things that we have talked about on the podcast before, and Pat Brown, who recently joined us from GE within the last few months, that, within Section 864, Congress did grant Treasury the right to be able to repeal interest or to turn off interest expense apportionment where appropriate. So in my view, and certainly others' view, they have the opportunity to turn that off. Now, the question, does that really reflect the intent of Congress? Who knows what the actual intent was? I know there's also been a number of things floated as far as potential high tax exception for GILTI. How that would actually be constructed is kind of a head scratcher to me. Maybe by the time that people are listening to this podcast, we'll have some guidance on that. That could certainly change the game with respect to, trying to manage some of that leakage for companies with your profile that just don't have that low taxed income to try to turn off the GILTI inclusion. But, Treasury has got their hands full. And you actually made a point that I want to reiterate, we spend a lot of time, particularly on cross-border tax talks, being very critical of these international provisions, but it's helpful to be reminded by a company, particularly the size of P&G, that like the 21% rate really went a long way
totally.
to competitiveness. And, we like to spend a lot of time, as I think I started the podcast, navel gazing on some of these issues and being critical, which is, I think, just the nature of the job. But the Congress certainly made a big step forward.
No question. The rate was huge. And okay, maybe we're not in a purely territorial system, but we're in a system that was much better than the old system, and it'll continue to get tweaked. And yeah, it was a big step forward. Now, having said that, Doug, we use the concept internally. We're at halftime. Okay. I think there's going to be a round two of tax reform debate, particularly as we get out a few years and we get closer to, call it fiscal cliff 2.0, where individual tax rates are going to go back up to the historic rates, and that's going to be a very politically dynamic situation that Congress is going to have to deal with. And certainly, I think the corporate tax rate will be in play. I mean, if you think about it, when you include state taxes, the average U.S. tax rate now is 23, 24%. We're average with the rest of the world.
That's right.
It's not like we started another race to the bottom. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens with corporate tax rates around the world. I mean, the trend has been, since the 86 Tax Reform Act, the rate going down. I think outside the U.S. it was around 48, 49% in 86, and it had a downward trend at, 23, 24%. I think is probably the OECD average today. We got to average, okay, but we are a long way. We're much further than we were 2 years ago. So yeah, I think we're going to continue to be active in Washington on making sure that we keep the competitive system we got. The other thing I'll mention, interestingly, you mentioned the toll charge earlier. I think we had a toll charge of around $3.9 billion, and the return.
Is that was the tax?
That was the tax.
Right. Yeah. That's not the inclusion. That is the tax paid.
That was the tax. We had about, I think roughly $50 billion of undistributed earnings, not represented by cash. Okay.
Right.
Again, that cash had been reinvested in the business. Maybe we had $12 billion of cash. Don't hold me to any of these numbers, but I think at the end of the day, it's a 7 or 8 year payback with the rate to cover the toll charge.
Right.
All right. So if we're going to raise the income tax rate, all of a sudden that toll charge, getting the payback on the rate's going to be extended even further. And so I think that gets lost a little bit. But there was a stiff penalty or stiff toll charge, if you will, to get to a new system, and I hope we can maintain where we're at, or certainly not go backwards.
Yeah, you mentioned there's kind of the big fiscal cliff, and then there's already some of what I would call kind of the smaller cliffs as we think about 163J. We think about moving the save the DA, moving from the EBITDA to EBIT. There's the increase on rate on FDII, and so some of those smaller cliffs that they're going to have to deal with. One of the concerns that I have, and this has actually already been proposed, I think Doggett proposed the repeal of Section 250. And so, one of the concerns that I have from an overall stability perspective is that, Section 250, the repeal of that is our 50% exclusion for guilty, right. And it's also the FDII, lower rate of tax on foreign-derived intangible income that we've talked about. And so just the repeal of that one section would all of a sudden really move us almost to a worldwide system other than the 10% return on the tax basis and your depreciable tangible assets. How would something like that affect the company? What's your reaction to how uncompetitive? I mean, is that even a step back from the 35%?
I would think the rate still matters, okay? But yes, look, the system we're in today is unlike anywhere else in the world. And yeah, I think that would be taking a further step back of unleveling the playing field, if you will, for U.S. multinationals. So, our competition in the UK doesn't have a guilty. They don't have a worldwide system. Our competition in Germany doesn't have a guilty. They don't have a worldwide system. And so, yeah, if we want to, competitiveness, it's a competitive environment out there, right? And, we're not just competing against U.S. multinationals. We're competing against Asia multinationals, European multinationals. Local competition is fierce. So, we want to continue to try to move towards the most competitive system we can. Frankly, if as well as to attract inbound investment
Sure.
and make the U.S. a place people want to establish headquarters. And so, yeah, we're going to continue to push for the most competitive system the U.S. can possibly manage.
So let's move to digital taxation. I know it's something that you and the company have been very focused on, and I've been talking to a number of our clients about this issue. But Procter Gamble, you guys make diapers, right? Like, why, Tadd, is digital taxation relevant for a consumer market, consumer products company?
Yeah. Well, it's a very obvious question, and it's the one actually when we're meeting with policymakers around the world, one of the first questions we get. And I think, fundamentally, the digital project has evolved, okay, since I think it was first kind of launched. But I think if you fundamentally understand what it is, I think the digital policy was attempting to do, ultimately it was to try to give more value to, call it, I think of it as the market, okay? And whether that's the consumer in the market because you're accessing them, or potentially you're gathering data that you can ultimately monetize or utilize. It was fundamentally the consumer in the market providing something of value. And so maybe that market should derive more of the allocation of profit for tax purposes. Well, we're a consumer products company, right? So inevitably, where's that debate in? And can you ring fence that concept to the digital companies? And by the way, I'm not even sure I know how to define a digital company. I mean, we're a very digital company.
Right.
Whether it's, selling through e-commerce channels, whether we're going direct to consumer, whether we are a massive collector of data.
Right, collector of information on your customers, trends.
Hey, we've been collecting consumer trend data for 180 years.
Right.
Okay, so it's maybe more efficient to do it today than it was 180 years ago. But so I just think inevitably, we were going to get dragged into the digital debate. So why not try to get out in front of it? And so, I think what I think it's evolved to is more of the who's got the taxing rights debate, okay, source country or residence country. And that's going to impact all of us. And so I think, that's why we find it important. That's why we are very engaged in the process. And, our goal is to educate policymakers, whether it's in the U.S. or Europe or Asia or the developing world, developed countries. Why is digital important to P&G? Why do we care about it? What's our perspective? Does the arm's length standard work? Okay, we're a firm believer in the arm's length standard. I think we're a good case of yes, it does work, and may it need to get tweaked in order to kind of resolve a political debate, perhaps. But our goal is to try to get to a solution that largely maintains the arm's length standard. Maybe it's tweaked a bit, but we're a firm believer it can work, and I think governments that understand us and know us understand that it can work. So
explain that a little bit. What do you mean by that the arm's length standard works, and how does the digital debate potentially really impact that arm's length standard?
The example I use at P&G is we earn $12, $13, $14 billion of pre-tax profit, okay? Who gets to tax it, okay? We could have a supply chain where we're doing research and development in China. We own the intellectual property from those activities in the United States. We license that intellectual property to Europe for use in the European business. We happen to be selling a product in the UK that's manufactured in Japan, okay? How are we gonna allocate that profit for tax purposes? Well, the arm's length standard has been the basis to do that for a very long time, and there's been a lot of experience with it, and you're basically allocating profit to value drivers.
Right.
Okay? And by the way, in that value chain, everybody's contributed something, okay, in order to generate profit for the company, and the arm's length standard is just the process to determine what each party earns. And I think the debate is when you have above routine margins, okay, the question is, and you've got real intangible profit. I come back to we're a $250, $260 billion market cap company. $50 billion of physical assets. What is that intangible? And the real question is, where should the profit attributable to those intangible activities go? Should it go to where the intellectual property is created? Should it go to where the consumer exists? Okay, and I think that's fundamentally the debate. And so that was probably a little more explanation than you were looking for, but I think the debate ultimately is, when you're a high margin company and you're getting returns from intangible assets, where should that get allocated for tax purposes?
Yeah, that was a fantastic explanation, by the way. And I think, particularly for some of us non-transfer pricing folks, like just being able to think about the value chain and then, just ultimately where that end customer sits does not necessarily mean where that is where all the profit should be.
Right.
And I love the example that you give, because each of those respective jurisdictions that you mentioned, from Japan, China, UK, and the US, all deserves something.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah, and it may be a routine return, or it may be a above routine return, depending on the importance of their participation in the value chain. And that's a complicated exercise, and we've been debating that issue with governments around the world for the last 20, 30 years. And we've been very transparent. We help them understand our business model. We help them understand how we apply the arm's length standard, and we've gained a lot of credibility and trust in that regard. And we've got, frankly, a lot of predictability and certainty right now with regards to the current system. And I think the governments would say, P&G is paying their fair share, okay, at least as defined by the arm's length standard.
Right. What advice do you have for other big U.S. multinationals? Obviously, P&G, an iconic U.S. multinational. I think that you guys are leading by example as far as engaging with policymakers in the U.S., trying to educate policymakers outside to really understand the broad implications of some of these sweeping changes. What do you tell some of your peers and about how to engage in that process, or any advice that you have for other companies?
Well, I think first it's to try to be engaged, okay, and to understand what is the debate, okay. And I think it's a big investment of time, okay. I mean, we all have a lot on our plate to do, and fortunately, P&G is a company that understands the importance of tax policy and getting to pro-growth policies and trying to get as much certainty and predictability as possible. And so we invest a lot in that process, and I know that not everyone can do that, but I think stay engaged, be involved where you can be, understand what the debate is, and educate policymakers. Help them understand your business, help them understand how you do things, how you apply the arm's length standard, what's important to you from a tax policy perspective, what are your ideas in order to continue to help grow the global economy. And I think that education process is important. Again, it takes a big investment of time, but I would, it does have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, Tadd, that's great advice. I think we're going to leave it at that. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Special thanks to our first taxpayer guest, Tadd Fowler from Procter Gamble, for joining me on this podcast. I'm Doug McConey, PwC's International Tax Services Leader. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for another exciting edition of Cross-Border Tax Talks.